Hi guys, my name is Jacob Lisi. I'm a software engineer at Grafana Labs. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the new Flux language and the support we have in Grafana currently. So I guess start with about me. I do a mishmash of things at Grafana Labs. A lot of the stuff I work on is to do with our hosted metrics backend. I've done some work on a lot of plugins and data source stuff for Grafana. Like one example was Kubernetes, and I've done some recent work on the Flux data source. So just as a primer, Flux is incredibly powerful and incredibly expressive. As far as time series language, like query languages go, it's, I think, arguably the most expressive one that there is. It's Turing complete, it's composable, you can create packages for it. It's basically, it's its own ecosystem in itself based on like the capabilities it has. And who here uses Grafana? And I'm assuming everyone else here uses Influx. How many people are using Flux with Grafana? So not many people, or anyone, I guess, yet. But I'm going to talk to you today about our data source that we've created for Flux. That it's still in the beta stages right now. As Flux is changing, we have to keep pace. So we haven't necessarily like integrated it fully into Grafana yet. But you can download it, and in the future, it probably will become like a standard feature in every Grafana install. And then, so Flux design goals. Flux kind of takes a really ambitious viewpoint in terms of how it approaches creating a query language for a time series database. It is kind of going above and beyond and commoditizing like time series as like databases as a whole. It's taking an approach where instead of having to worry about like what languages your time series database can understand or what you can use to query it, instead it's going to be like an interstitial layer that even if you wanted to use PromQL or SQL, like it could, like Flux could handle that. It also is incredibly powerful, and the fact that you can create functions or chain functions or do all of these types of things allows you to do things that you could really not do in other query languages. I mean, like technically Prometheus QL is Turing complete, but there's no user-defined functions, and to do something along the magnitude that you can do in Flux, it probably wouldn't be possible in PromQL, at least reasonably. So let's do a little bit of a syntax overview. I'm assuming everyone here has been looking at Flux all day for the past like 3 hours. So I don't know how much of this is going to be new, but when you start, like just a quick recap, when you start off with Flux, every query you basically have to signal where you're getting your data from. And that's the from statement. And you can actually assign that data to a variable. Just goes to show you that like this is more than just a query language. It's really a full-featured programming language. But this is like right here would be the basis for a query. This would be a really far-reaching query. It would basically like go over every data point that you have, but this is a starting point. You have your database, your telegraph. It will auto-default to what retention it chooses. And then it's basically getting every single variable, every single metric in that database for the host equals my server. And the range value. So you have to give a start range value, and then when you query to Flux. And actually, we do some stuff in Grafana that makes your life a little bit easier, because in Grafana, everyone here who uses it, you know that the time interval is actually set in the top right and kind of automated for the user, so we make sure that that works with Flux. So I assume everyone here has a good idea of what you can do with Flux. You can chain together various functions and manipulate the data you get from Influx, and it ends up basically being able to display however you want. That's one interesting thing about Flux is we're going to kind of see later is that Grafana panels have a lot of really interesting UI features to basically change how you display or orient your data. One thing you notice when you start using Flux is that a lot of those options details within Grafana for display, you can kind of just do in your query language, which is kind of cool. And like one example of that would be like windowing time points so that, and like whether or not you want them connected and like things like that. You can really put that all into Flux if you want to, and it takes a lot of the complexity out of the Grafana panel. And then, so let me move on to some other features like user-defined functions. This is probably one of the more unique features of Flux compared to other languages we support in Grafana. It means that the Flux plugin really has to, like the Flux data source really has to do a lot more parsing and a lot more auto generation to be usable. And in a certain sense, like, it really like changes what you can do with a query in Grafana versus some other databases. The other thing that I recommend everyone checks out, and this was really useful when helping get this plugin to start working, that I'm going to show you in a second, is the standard library for Flux. So Flux is packaged with a bunch of different functions, and you can kind of find them using, you just look for a .flux file, and then the supporting package will be next to it, usually somewhere in any GitHub repo, and you can find a lot of really cool stuff in all of the different underlying implementations for the functions within Flux. Some other things that Flux can do is you can do math on tables, like, and join tables. This was something that, I mean, in Grafana, when we talked to someone in Grafana who used Influx, a lot of questions came up about joins, and we really didn't have an answer. But Flux really goes above and beyond in terms of being able to manipulate and join and query data across from different data sources. I mean, the fact that you can basically take data points from various Flux data sources and then do manipulations and joins on them is pretty unique, and, like, I would think a really powerful feature in the time series database world. The other really cool thing about Flux is the response format. So if you look at a lot of time series databases, the response format is one of two things. It's some kind of like large JSON blob with it'll be your metric, the tags, and then like a data point list of like timestamp value. Flux, I think, takes an interesting approach where it just gives you a raw CSV, which, first of all, is really human readable, and you can just grab it, copy and paste it, and do what you want if you don't necessarily want to use it in Grafana. It makes it a pretty usable and user-friendly data source in the sense that, like, the raw output you get is not something you necessarily have to parse. You could literally load this into Excel, which I think is a pretty cool feature to have in terms of usability. So the hard part today, probably if you're a Grafana user with Flux, is how do you actually get it to run in Grafana? So the first thing you have to do is make sure your influxd is running with Flux enabled. So when your influxdb.config file, under the HTTP header, you type in flux enabled equals true, and then your influxdb by default will support Flux queries. And the next step would just be make sure you have data in your influxdb. In terms of Grafana, you just have to make sure that, cool. In terms of Grafana, you just have to make sure you have a version of Grafana after 5.3, and all future versions will support the Flux data source. And to install the influx data source into your Grafana, currently the best way to do that, is, because Flux is changing, the plugin changes a lot, is to go right to the GitHub repo and clone it into your data/plugins directory in Grafana. If anyone needs help with that, like, talk to someone and we'll be able to help you out. But so you clone the repo into your data/plugins directory and build the plugin, and then you just restart your Grafana, and the Grafana will load the plugin by default. And then you just go through the process of adding your Flux data source, adding dashboards, and then I'll show you how to make panels in Flux and do some other cool things that we've added in Grafana to make working with Flux a little bit easier. So let's get to the good part. So the demo, I'm going to go through how you can set up Grafana with Flux, load up the dashboard, some of the tips and tricks to how to use Flux in Grafana. And also, I created this repo on my GitHub, Grafana Flux demo. And like, if you download and clone that repo and go into that directory, you'll probably be able to follow along and then be able to play with it for yourself on your own machine if you're interested in doing that. So I'll leave that up for just a second if anyone wants to try that out and follow along. Okay. So let me get out of my slides for a second and pull up a terminal. I'm already in the repo here. So that font is probably not working for everybody, I would imagine. Let me know when it's good, okay? Good for everybody? A little bit more? How about in the back? Is this good? Thumbs up when it's good, Daniel. It's getting pretty big now. There? Okay, good. So I'm going to start this entirely fresh. Let me delete all the containers I had running Docker Compose. So if I'm going to be running using Docker Compose, let me show you the Docker Compose file real quick. So what this file has is creates an influx container using version 174, exposes port 8083 and port 8086. I'm going to mount a config file and a data directory from my local in the directory that I'm in. There's a Grafana latest, so this will be Grafana 1. I think this will be 5.3 unless you updated it to 6 for latest yesterday. And so it's 6 now, which is fine. And then a latest version of Telegraph. If anyone's following along, one thing I want to mention is that there is a .runsh in the file, and it should be called .setup.sh, but what this is going to do is it's going to download and put the InfluxDB Flux data source into a plugins directory that's going to be mounted to our Grafana image. So if you look here, so you can see halfway down in this volumes, I'm mounting a plugins directory into my Grafana at varlib Grafana plugins. And in that directory, I have my InfluxDB Flux data source, which that runsh will generate that for you and download it for you. Cool, so let me run Docker Compose up. Cool, so now that I've ran Docker Compose up, I have my Grafana image, I have my influx image, and assuming somewhere in here there'll be a telegraph. Here we go, up at the top. So we have all of our images, they're all spinning up. Let's go back to the bottom. You can see here on this line that I'm going to highlight, that means we know our plugin loaded. So we have that Flux plugin in our Grafana. It's been registered. Whether or not it's working, we'll find out in a second. Our telegraph is writing to our influx database. All looks good. So let's actually open up Grafana and take a look. So we've got our default localhost Grafana login. We're not going to change the password. So cool, we have our installed data source, Flux, InfluxDB beta. Let's actually add the data source. So let's go here. You can see here above InfluxDB, we have our Flux beta data source type. So we'll add that. For HTTP URL, we linked, in the Docker Compose, it changes the name of the host for InfluxDB to InfluxDB as far as Grafana sees it, if you look at like the link section of the Docker Compose. So change that to InfluxDB right there at port 8086. Let's do our default bucket as Telegraph with the retention of autogen. There was no password. Cool. So our database is connected, it's found, it seems to be working. So let's go and actually dig into actually creating a dashboard. So open up our dashboard panel and let's take a look. So the first thing we're going to see here is the auto, so the default query to Flux. It goes to the bucket that you set as your default. See this little section right here? You'll see. Also, by the way, is this big enough for everybody? Okay. Thumbs up again when it's good. Good? Cool. So we have our from bucket, our telegraph autogen bucket is where we're getting our data from. This range value, see this $ range? That looks kind of like a Grafana template tag. It functions basically the same way, and what it does is it'll take the timestamp information from the top right corner of Grafana, like the intervals and stuff, and it'll basically format that for a range function in Flux. So that's really nifty in the sense that it lets you still use like the Grafana time range functions with Flux. And that is good because it would be really hard to make a Grafana dashboard that is flexible otherwise. And then the last section is just a limit N100. So this query right here is a really bad query. It's going to basically get everything in that bucket, as you can see here. So like this is a lot of random series. Basically, it's all the series in that telegraph bucket, at least 1,000 of them, not every single one. You can see right here, there's this text box right here. And this is actually the raw data that's returned from from Flux as a CSV. It's really useful when helping to build your query to like actually be able to visualize the raw data that you're working with, and then like it makes sense when you compose later when you actually have the CSV next to it. So when you run a function, you can kind of look back and forth as you're writing your query on the left and make sure that things make sense and that you're hitting the right tag or the right field. And like as you can see in this row right here, one of the third rows, you can basically have all of the metadata information that you're going to need when you're building your Flux queries, like your fields, your measurements, the tag host, all that stuff. So let's get a query that's not just literally scanning the database. So the first thing you'll notice here we added is we have autocomplete. So the first thing it suggests when you go to a new line and tab in is you get the autocomplete for a pipe, which is it just allows you to start composing together the aspects of your Flux query. So let's tab into that, and then the next thing I'm going to do is a filter. So let's do that here. So the filter defaults to value greater than 0, which what it defaults to is kind of irrelevant, and probably will change in the future as we try and figure out how to make this more usable and more intuitive. So I'm going to change that to measurement, and then let's get all of the measurements let's get all of the metrics for the measurement of CPU. Cool, and then we can see the result up here. So CPU, this is all of our measurements for guest usage, usage IO weight, basically all of the Telegraph default CPU metrics. And then as we start going further, we can autocomplete, filter, and then add a field, and even drill down even farther. Let's do usage idle. Sorry if I'm typing slowly. It's like the angle on this is not comfortable, but it'll work though. Cool, so we narrowed it down even further, and basically at this point we have pretty good set of autocomplete features within Grafana for Flux functions. So if we just like type in a random value like S, we could see all of these different, you can't see them. You can see all of the different functions for Flux that you can use and compose into this, and each of them will give you a basic template when you select them for something you can do. Like you'll tab in and then it'll give you a basic template, and then you can edit that function that you added from there. Cool. So the next thing I want to show people is what we've created called shortcodes, so this is another feature that kind of falls in the realm of autocomplete. So there. Cool. So you guys can see, everyone here can see that it gives you the option to, when you have a blank query screen, to either go to the default bucket with a range or what this telegraph shortcode. So this telegraph ... that's the telegraph stands for the default bucket for our Flux data source, telegraph. The next thing that pops up is a list of measurements. So we can do CPU again and tap into that. And then the next thing that'll pop up is a list of fields under the CPU measurement. So we can do usage idle one more time. And then it allows us to expand that shortcode into a full query for Flux for CPU usage idle. And that's a really nifty way to quickly compose things in Grafana. And as we build upon that, we're going to try and improve or like make a more user-friendly syntax based on whether people like the ... I find it incredibly useful to quickly put together queries using that syntax. And I would imagine it's definitely a lot easier than typing out your entire filter function and like adding the measurement every time or choosing your bucket. It just makes it a little bit quicker, a little bit more shorthand. Okay. So I guess the next thing I want to show everybody is we have Flux displaying as a graph. Let's do it as a table. So I'm going to create a table panel, I'm going to do my shorthand, telegraph, measurement. I'm going to go to kernel, and I'm going to do processes forked. And expand that out. And so now we're going to have a nice table with our processes forked, except that table doesn't look really nice at all. You have basically just a timestamp value, but like all of the fields and tags are just up in the top panel, which is not really what we're looking for. So if you change the format from time series to table, that looks a lot better. It basically breaks out each field and each tag into its own column, which definitely helps readability. So the table, so that is down here in the bottom left for anyone who didn't see. There's this format as. You can choose between format as time series and format as table. And this just allows you to, it basically just changes how Grafana interprets the data and how it formats it for the table panel. And just whether or not what to do with fields and what to do with measurements, whether they're part of each data point or whether you can compose it into each column. And then actually one thing I forgot to mention is in the bottom right here, you can see result tables and result records. So when you query Flux, Grafana will basically give some metadata at the bottom about like the amount of data returned within your query. You can see that here, and that's all just composed from the CSV. Cool. So the next thing I guess we can talk about is template tags. Everyone here uses template tags in Grafana, I would assume. So let's see how we do them in Flux. So if we go to the Flux data source here, there's a few functions here that will basically allow us to, similar to how it works with Prometheus, just some functions that like aren't necessarily specific to like Flux's internal workings, but just Grafana in the plugin, we basically grab these, convert it to a Flux query, and then basically get a bunch of metadata that we can display in a template tag. So the first one I'm going to look at is measurement. So let's call this measurement query Flux fresh never measurement telegraph. Type something. Sorry, 1 second. I think I might have mistyped something or closed something out. Oh, I know what I did wrong. I just forgot the S at the end of measurements. Cool, there we go. So, as you can see, this measurement function queried, it composed a Flux query and got back a list of measurements within Flux that we can use to as a template tag. So let's add our measurement template tag and then go back to here. So cool, up here we now have CPU. And let's see how we can put that to use. We can add a graph up here, edit. Let's, I'm going to use the telegraph shortcode. And then instead of measurement equals CPU right here, I'm going to do measurement equals measurement as a template tag. Cool, refresh it. And so this template tag interpoled into it, and CPU, now it's all these are the CPU metrics. Change that to swap. The template tag switched to swap. Now all the swap metrics are here. So you can see how you can start using template tags within your Flux queries. The next template tag query that is specific to Flux is, believe, measurement values. Sorry. is tags. So we can do the same thing here. Set our Flux database as the data source, and then for that it's just tags, telegraph, measurement. And the only tag it looks like for our measurement currently is host. And then the next thing we can do is tag values, but it's not really interesting to look at just all the host values. So instead, let's do keys, field keys. So set our Flux data source again, field keys. Just gonna make sure I do our database. So it's telegraph. And then our measurement is our template variable measurement. Cool, and so now we have all of our keys down at the bottom. And let's pull this all together. Go back in here, let's set this to CPU. And edit this up here. I could do an and here, I'm just gonna do a new line. I don't think you'll be able to read it when it goes off the edge. Filter. Instead of value here, take field equals fields, our template variable. Cool, and now you can see we can start iterating through our fields and only having the ones that we want showing up. And basically very similar to how template tags work in any other data source. You can get all of the metadata you need, and then you just use the $ notation in Grafana, and you can throw it in wherever you want in your Flux queries. And before Grafana throws the query to Flux, it's going to go through those queries, find all those $, and figure out what to put in its place. Cool, so the next thing I want to show you guys is annotations. So let's figure out like a good metric to annotate. I choose processes forked because if we do a little bit of work on it, so let's say we make a graph panel here and then start with telegraph, go to kernel, and then down at the bottom where you guys can't see it, processes forked. So now we have our processes forked queries. And let's see it over the past hour. Oh, we have a nice little spike here. That's exactly what I wanted. Cool. So this is the number of processes my system has forked over time. As you can see right here, there was a bit of a jump. So let's see if we can isolate that jump down into a Flux query and then create that as an annotation across all of our graphs. So everyone here, does everyone know what an annotation is in Grafana? Cool, so if not, you're about to see. It's pretty cool, and it's a nifty feature to really enhance like the usability of your graphs. So in Flux, let's take this query right here, and then instead of it being just a query of the system over time, let's actually turn it into something a little bit more descriptive, or for our use case. Cool, so now we've changed it from just a graph of this is it over time, which is a sum value, and turned it into a derivative value. So we can see our little spike here, it jumps up to 7.12. Let's do a window function over every 10 minutes. And then the next thing let's do is filter out everything below, let's do 0.1. So now we just have our one little point right here. I don't want to just do window. Actually, let me see what it looks like without that. It looks kind of the same. So let's just do Perfect. That's exactly what I want it to look like for how I want my annotations to look. Because I don't want it to be 2 annotations, I want it to be just one. So now that we took our processes graph and we turned it into basically just a point where one of the processes like really spiked. So like at 5 minutes ago, for some reason my CPU decided it needed to fork a bunch of processes, God knows why. But it happened somewhere along the line. And so let's go back to our settings up here at the top, click on Annotations, and then choose Flux as our data source. And we don't want it hidden, we want it to be vibrant and visible. And let's throw that query in there and see what we get out of there. So if we look across all our graphs now, we see this. Let's blow up our CPU graph. So we can see in our CPU graph right here, I don't know if you guys can see it, it's like kind of thin. Can you guys see the annotation line down the center right here? And you can see up where my cursor is, you can see the pop-up of the value of the annotation. And you can change that to be a little bit more descriptive about what you're seeing. Can everyone see that? Okay, cool. So Flux allows you, like, because Flux is so powerful, you can really take like a lot of different things and compose them together and throw them into different parts of Grafana. So like that example right there is like pretty simple and not very useful, but like you can very much think of times where like you want to look at something spiking and have that not necessarily as the as the data within your graph, but like as context within your graph. So like that's one of the really useful things within Flux. It's very powerful and it allows you, like when you combine it with annotations or a few other features in Grafana, it really lets you compose some really cool dashboards. Cool. So let me just make sure, I'm going to go back to my slides and just look through and make sure I've went through a good amount of what the Flux, cool. So I think in terms of like Grafana functionality with Flux, we have the ability to query using the Flux query language. We have some shorthand codes. We have some autocomplete stuff. We have full feature with tags. We have full features with annotations. So it's pretty full featured right now. And it's the only thing that is problematic with it is that it's not packaged with Grafana. So if you're an InfluxDB user, you actually have to go and install this plugin separately if you wanted to access your Influx. And hopefully in the future that will probably change in the pretty proximal future. So that's something, if you're using InfluxDB now and not using Flux with Grafana, the barrier to entry will get much lower in the next couple months, honestly. And as time goes on and we start getting more user reports, we're going to really try and refine how we do some of the syntax highlighting, tab completion. The table preview is really useful now for, like, I mean, I find it incredibly useful when building Flux plugins, although like it doesn't really look really pretty to have just that large text box. So maybe formatting that, and I mean, you can always go to the Query Explorer in Grafana if you really want to look at the CSV. And things like that are bound to be refined in the future. But I think it's a really good start, and Flux is an incredibly powerful language. I think that, I mean, it's definitely worth exploring if you haven't done so yet. So in terms of the roadmap, one of the things that kind of like when a plugin or a data source graduates in Grafana, like it gets an alerting backend. So that'll probably, I mean, InfluxDB already has one so that you can basically create an alert in Grafana that uses InfluxDB as a data source. Flux will probably be the next one we do for that. And so when it gets integrated fully, that probably is something to look forward to. Again, transitioning to a default plugin, and then also some story, like creating some kind of story around migrating your current InfluxDB dashboards to Flux. And the way Flux is designed, I don't think that should be too difficult. I mean, like, to be fair, like, I think one of the easiest aspects of Flux that came across when we were doing the shortcode work, like when you do like the dot telegraph and all that stuff, it's very easy to take like a query from another language and compose it in Flux. It's a very machine generatable language. Just maybe it's the piping syntax or a few other things about it, but it very much makes the process easy when you're trying to generate it using code. And that's one of the reasons, I mean, I think it's really nice to work with in that regard. And I imagine like that's really going to help the adoption of the language in the future. So I appreciate everyone listening. Is there any questions about Flux or Grafana currently? Or just in general, the future of Flux and Grafana, things you can do in the back?
So there's talk about that alerting tick screens sort of going away over time. Is there any plan for would we ever be defining alerts in Grafana that you guys that are some of those capacity tick screen actions?
So you're asking basically, is there plans in Grafana to have, like, really build out our alerting?
Well, it's more of like the Flux it's talked about being used for alerting as well, I believe, not just the query language. But it's curious, it's very specific to the query portion that is the plan for.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I mean, like, honestly, like, one of the cool things about, like, a language like Flux, or like the similar, like, you can do very similar things with Prometheus to some extent, is they're very expressive languages. So, like, if you built a very simple, like, Boolean select statement, like, alerting system in Grafana, like, the languages can do a lot of the work for you. At the same time, like, the alerting conversation in Grafana is not really, like, settled at this point. And I wouldn't be surprised if, like, there's probably a big talk next year about alerting. God knows what, like, it actually will consist of, but Grafana learning is not a finished story. I don't think anyone knows the future of it perfectly, but there's definitely a lot of work being done on it, and it's something that's definitely being considered heavily, is what I'll say, and I don't necessarily have a great answer at this time. Sorry.
I'll just add, so tick script to Flux conversion is something we're talking about internally. There will be a path at some point to migrate those. And then tasks, which are going to be the new essentially learning framework, essentially. Those are all API driven, so you can 100% define those from the API and update them in that way.
Cool. I mean, that sounds good to me. So, yes.
What kind of optimizations engine can do? So that doesn't matter what's first, range function or?
Yeah, so Flux actually has a lot of gotchas as it comes to like the ordering of your, and like how you compose your query. I didn't go through it there, but like there's certain things that if you do your query wrong, or you sort things, like if you change the order of your functions, you can do things like a full table scan when all you wanted is one metric. So ordering is really important in Flux. And that really, where that's really going to come through is how we do autocomplete and like syntax highlighting, and in terms of like actually like query optimization type stuff. We want users to be able to put whatever, like we want the raw Flux query to go through. Like you don't want to be doing that on the front end in Grafana. Like if Flux implements internal optimizations, that's great, but like we don't want to mess with how their query is structured until, like we can do autocomplete stuff to put them on the right path, but in terms of like actually like changing like how their query is formed in Grafana and sent to Flux, we'd rather like the user be able to do whatever they want and not have like some JavaScript rigmarole messing with that. Does that make sense? Is that what you were asking? Okay. Yes.
This is really cool, and it would be super helpful for us that we're doing. But yet you mentioned that it's always a beta product, and because Flux itself is still changing, there's still kind of a roadmap.
I think like, so Flux is about a year old at this point. Breaking changes that have hurt, like that have basically made the plugin in Grafana not work with Flux, there's been a few. I'm sure there'll be at least a few more like over time, and like as the user adoption of Flux goes up, we can get more. Like I mean, like we need to. We're not constantly like checking for bugs and breaking changes constantly, but like we do our best and like try and keep it up to date as possible when we find stuff or like when things come to our attention. And I think as Flux gets more and more popular, like that'll kind of sort itself out as we get more and more user feedback and like issues start getting reported more often. So, but I mean, at this point, like, not very few people in Grafana using Grafana use Flux currently because the data source is not packaged default with Grafana, and to use it, you actually have to go to the repo and download it. We probably can look forward to putting it into the plugin package API. Like, if you did, anyone here use like the Grafana client to like install packages? So like that, you could. I would assume we can get that running really soon with the newest version. Yes.
On the Flux language, when you were doing a filter,
Yeah.
you did something like a measurement equal to the string. But
Yeah.
you actually did the filter, it was not exact match.
What are you referring to?
The Flux query that you wrote, where you were searching for measurement like CPU, it searched for all the measurements. Is it like Flux language treats two equals as...
So when because I did that multiple times during, I did a filter for measurement a few times. So like, can you give me a specific like when like? Let me pull it up again. So like you're saying that I didn't what it.
It is a substring search it is doing. It's not doing a string match.
No, it's doing a match when you do the double equals. Yeah, you can do regex in the filter too. Yeah, that's an option. But I think I'm pretty sure I was doing exact match.
No, it didn't do the exact. It brought up all the measurements.
No, that was the first time, and then once I added the filter, it didn't. Yeah, if you look at it, if you go back and look, you can see. Any other questions? Cool, I think we're all set. I don't know, we're doing it on time. Awesome.